Hey guys, it's Old Man. Today, I want to go over probably one of the biggest topics. I think there's like a huge amount of misinformation and, misconceptions about in this whole like immersion learning community. And that is the dialects in Japanese. I see all this focus about, learning standard Japanese, learning Tokyo Japanese, whatever you want to call it. And I don't really understand why so many people are so focused on just this one dialect without thinking about all the other dialects that are in Japanese and considering that it's only a real small part of the population that speak standard, Tokyo Japanese. So I don't understand what the focus is and what people's obsession is with mastering this one type of Japanese when there's so many others to consider and think about. So today I wanted to go over a few of the other dialects, how they're different to Tokyo Japanese, and also what are the merits of learning other dialects in Japanese and why you might want to choose, say, the Kansai dialect over Tokyo Japanese. So first off, just as a kind of brief overview, for those of you who don't know, the Japanese that you learn, say, in language schools or textbooks or anything like that, that'll be Tokyo Japanese. I don't know exactly when it was, but at some point in history, the dialect that they speak in Tokyo was set to be the standard Japanese, and then throughout Japan, that's what's considered, standard. So on news broadcast stations, all of that, they use the standard dialect of Japanese. But in reality, and then this video, I'm not going to call it standard Japanese because it's not really standard or anything. It's more like just the Tokyo dialect of Japanese. So I'm just going to be calling it the Tokyo dialect all throughout this, series and all of that. So yeah, there's, pretty much countless different variations of Japanese and dialects in Japan, depending on where you are in Japan. And pretty much every region has their own kind of regional dialect that is, used amongst the people of the community in that area. Then you might ask, okay, what changes in these dialects? What's the difference, say, between Tokyo Japanese and Osaka Japanese? Or, the whole Kansai area is generally, brought into being called the Kansai dialect. You might ask, okay, what's the difference between these dialects and what's the difference between all these other regional dialects? And the general thing that kind of changes, there's a few things that change pretty commonly throughout all the dialects. And that is, for one, the pitch accent patterns of all the dialects change depending on the region. There's kind of groups, say Kansai has although it depends on where you are in Kansai, the pitch accent, there's a kind of general pitch accent group of Kansai, and then there's also, Tokyo Japanese pitch accent group, and it varies depending on where you are in Japan. As you can see, I've got a kind of thing, I'll put a thing up here, which kind of shows you the different areas, and all the different colors, talk pretty much are the different pitch accent pattern styles depending on where you are and what region you're in Japan. Another thing that commonly changes is the endings on sentences. So a real common thing will be how in standard Japanese or in Tokyo Japanese there's da. For example, you might say something like gakusei dakara, gakusei dakara, and they'll be da, they use da, you know what I mean? But in Kansai, they'll say, instead of using da, they'll use ya. And in many other areas in Japan, they'll be using ya instead of da. So for instance, instead of saying gakusei dakara, it'll be gakusei dakara. It changes, depending on where you are in Japan. For another example, you might say in Tokyo, they might say jan, nani nani jan, ii jan, they might say something like that. But in, say, for instance, Okayama, they'll say jagan, and the endings on a lot of the sentences will differ depending on where you are. That's one of the real common things that change as well. There's so many different little examples that I could give that we could be sitting here for hours and me telling you all about different dialects and that. But they're all pretty self-explanatory when you hear them. And when you hear it, if you don't understand the dialect and what they're saying, pretty much you can just look it up on your own and you'll know from there on. And a lot of the dialects have they're similar enough in their sentence endings and the way they change that if you learn a few, you can kind of understand all of them. There's no real problem with that. But just for those of you who don't know any Japanese yet and don't have enough listening ability to be able to tell on your own what the differences are, I thought I might just give a few little examples just there, just so you can, have a rough idea of how they differ. Now, a few different examples of dialects. You've obviously got Tokyo Japanese, which everyone knows. That's what's used in, TV shows, anime, on the news and all things like that. And that obviously sounds like this.
J-POP という言葉が生まれて、早30年ぐらい経ちました。90年代の初頭、J-WAVE の会議室の中で生まれたこの言葉、今ではですね、もう、日本のポップスを広く J-POP というのがもう当たり前に、定着していまして、海外でもそういう風にね捉えられています。
Then you've got the Kansai dialect.
お祝い事っていうのは昔から第一世代滅び生まれた人類の世代からな、こうやって食事パーティーっていうのは神に捧げるもの、日々のお礼を返すものとしてね、文化として残り継げられたものです。
思想強すぎへん。思想でも俺ね焼肉で結構詳しいんですよ。 これ見てください、この焼肉の霜あるじゃないですか。
はい。
ある方がね、いい肉なんですよ。
知識弱知識弱
which is used, all throughout Kansai, obviously Osaka, Kyoto, Kobe, all different places, Shiga, Nara, all these different areas, they use the general kind of Kansai dialect. Even within Kansai though, there's different kind of regional dialects. So say people in Kyoto speak completely different to people in Osaka. The way they speak in Kyoto and Osaka are part of the Kansai dialect group, so they're relatively similar compared to, like, if you were to compare them to, say, standard Japanese, well, Tokyo Japanese, but they're still different. And if you hear it and you're fluent in Japanese, you'd be able to tell the difference. Oh, this person's from, Kyoto probably, or this person's from Osaka. You can kind of tell. It's the same, for instance, like, obviously, we're Australians, we speak different to Americans, right? But even though we speak different, in America, there's not one dialect in America. People are going to have different accents depending on where they're from in America. It's kind of like that. So it's different even amongst the same kind of group of dialects, but it's still a completely different group to say, Australian English or British English or something like that. Then there's also, say, Okayama Ben.
いやこの前なうちがリンとスーパーにおったんじゃがほなちょうどリンちゃんの友達がおってうわなんでおるん言うてなそのスーパーでこう買い物しながらちょっと立ち話みたいな感じでしとったんよ
And also Hakata Ben from, like, around Hakata, so, like, Fukuoka and stuff.
マル君みたいに知るかマルのライブ行けよバカだれ俺今日怒っとうけんな当たり強いぞ俺今日ごめんなさいってめっちゃ謝った怖っそんなに謝られるとすごい引くわめちゃくちゃ引いた今俺怒っとうと俺は今ねバリクソ怒っとうけんマジでおいこのアプリまた俺のことシャドーバンにしたべ何も言ってないのにおいバカ AI がマジで何しようとや言ってなかろうが下ネタなんなマジでまた俺のことシャドーバンにしとろうがおい間抜け AI しっかりしろマジで何が起きたら俺のことがシャドーバンになるとや一生懸命井戸立てる話しとうのに立てんぞ井戸もう多分おかしいってなんでなん絶対おかしいやろやばいやろおかしい何も言ってないのにもうマジ井戸立ててやらんけんなあんだけ井戸立てるって言って俺のことシャドーバンにするんやったらやばいぞおいとんでもない面にやっとるわ本当に
Now I want to get into one of the things that I think there's a lot of, misconceptions about, and that is when do people use standard Japanese, or like I was saying, Tokyo Japanese. If you're, say, from Tokyo, obviously that's all the time, that's common sense. If you're from Tokyo, use it all the time because that's your dialect. But say you're from, like, I don't know, some random place like Nagano, some real regional area that has its own dialect, you might say, okay, well, these people speak their own regional dialect, but when you talk to them, they're going to be speaking in kind of standard Japanese. And what actually happens there is that these people, because it's such a small regional dialect, if they were to speak that to the average person from a different area, there's going to be a lot of stuff that the average person doesn't understand because it's such a small kind of regional dialect. And all these, like, little regional ones, say Nagano, or like tiny little country kind of places that aren't like a huge region, they're going to tend to speak or do their best to speak, Tokyo standard Japanese when they speak on, say YouTube, or they speak to other people from different prefectures or anything like that. And even when they do though, they're going to still have a slightly different way of speaking to people born in Tokyo. Their pitch accent is still going to be different. A lot of the time they'll have an accent still from their regional area, but they'll do their best to change it to standard Japanese. One of the reasons is, a lot of people get made fun of for having an accent. They might, get like, haha, you got an accent kind of thing. So a lot of people try and hide it or not speak it or not use it, but it really depends on where they're from and how that kind of accent is viewed by the general population in Japan. But then to use the previous example of, say, Hakata-ben, like from Fukuoka, that has a better kind of, like, there's people think girls who speak Hakata-ben, they're generally considered, like, cute in Japan. So, for instance, they may even play up their accent. When they talk to someone from somewhere else, they might put on their accent even stronger to kind of show it off and all of that. It just really depends on where you're from, depending on, like, whether they'll use standard Japanese. And then, of course, if you're in the workplace and you're from one of those regional little areas, you're not going to be speaking using your regional dialect. You're going to use the Tokyo Japanese because that's what's considered, proper, if you get what I mean. But then the one outlier with all of this is Kansai. People from Kansai, even when they speak politely or in work or whatever, they've got their own version of, like, keigo, like polite Japanese, that is the Kansai polite Japanese, which is just a different accent, kind of different usage of polite Japanese and all of that. But most people from Kansai make pretty much zero effort to ever speak standard Japanese. They just stick with their own dialect and they speak it all the time. If you go to Kansai, everyone's speaking in the Kansai dialect. It's, one of the real major dialects in Japan. Well, it's probably the biggest dialect other than Tokyo Japanese. And that's why it's pretty much respected. There's a lot of people on TV even speaking in the Kansai dialect, and it's pretty much, just as big as the Tokyo Japanese, really, in terms of, what it's considered to be like in Japan. It's not considered like the other dialects to be, some, country like dialect that no one uses, or some, something that's not really cool or that. A lot of the people who speak the Kansai dialect, they're considered cool or they're considered funny, because a lot of the comedy culture in Japan, manzai and like all that comedy culture comes from Kansai, from Osaka. So, a lot of people from Kansai can, generally considered more funny, more, humorous than people from Tokyo per se. So I hope that gives you kind of a rough idea of what the different dialects sound like to other people in Japan, and as well when Tokyo Japanese is used over the regional dialects. Now when it comes to actually learning Japanese yourself, and starting to output in that, of course you're going to have to pick one kind of dialect to focus in on in your output, because I suppose you can be speaking a mix of all different dialects, but you'll sound kind of weird. People will be like, what are you trying to sound like? Where are you from, kind of thing. It's fine if you're learning the Kansai dialect, but you're learning a bit of, Osaka, Kyoto, wherever. At that point, it's such a little detail, it doesn't really matter. And you say, especially if you're living overseas, if you're living in Japan and you're in Kansai, the Kansai dialect you're speaking will probably naturally go to whatever region you're living in. But yeah, in general, you want to be picking a dialect to kind of focus in on and, use when you speak. Now, a lot of people think okay, I'll just go with Tokyo Japanese because that's the standard Japanese, so I want to learn standard Japanese. But for me, it just seems kind of strange to be learning that standard Japanese. I get it if you want to live in Tokyo and you're super, want to live in Japan, you want to work in Japan, you want to live in Tokyo and all that. If that's the case, of course, I get it. You want to learn, Tokyo Japanese, standard Japanese. So whatever, that's whatever. I get that. But say the people that, have no real interest in living in Tokyo, or, they might live somewhere else in Japan or something like that, or not even plan on living in Japan. I don't really get what the obsession is with trying to have perfect Tokyo Japanese or focus straight into Tokyo Japanese when there's so many dialects in Japan. And really, if you look at it as just a population perspective, it's really a minority of the population that are born in Tokyo and speak Tokyo Japanese naturally, as their main kind of thing. So, although it's called generally now standard Japanese, I don't really get what the obsession is with just learning that. Nowadays you see more and more people, especially on my server now, people are doing the Kansai dialect and stuff like that. But there's so many different dialects in Japan. There's so many to pick from. You could pick any one you want. I would generally recommend picking it though using this kind of criteria. If you plan on living in Japan, or you already live in Japan in some region, learn that regional dialect. I feel like that's common sense though. I don't really need to say that. That's pretty obvious. Another way is when you get good enough to be able to discern the differences between the dialects and kind of hear what they sound like, pick the one you like, how it sounds. Don't get too obsessed with just trying to learn Tokyo Japanese. Pick whichever one you like the sound of and learn that one. So those are, some of the criteria that you might use to pick it. But this is why I personally believe, this is just my personal belief, but this is why I believe that you should learn a dialect in Japanese. One of the main reasons, to me at least, Tokyo Japanese just sounds kind of boring, everyone learns it. It's just standard. I don't know. It's almost got not as much personality to it to some of the other dialects in Japanese. You even meet some people from Tokyo who say they wish they spoke a dialect just because it has a bit more personality to it, you know what I mean? So, I reckon it's definitely worth learning a different dialect in Japanese because it gives a bit more personality and feeling to your Japanese, especially, say, for instance, one of the things I've experienced learning the Kansai dialect, when I go to the Kansai now, it's the reception of the people from Kansai is so much greater than what you'd ever get from the people in Tokyo if you knew Tokyo Japanese. Because if you learn Tokyo Japanese, you kind of expected to know that. Everyone learns that. So you go to Tokyo, speak it, they're like, oh, good job, you speak Japanese, good on you, kid. But if you're in, say you go to Kansai, I might go to some little town like Nara, or even just go to Osaka or something, and I speak how I do in the Kansai dialect, the reception is just crazy, nothing you'd really usually experience, because all of a sudden they open up to you because it's almost like you're one of the locals. So they open up to you more and speak to you you're their mate kind of thing. And so they open up to you way more, and the reception is so much better when you're speaking a local dialect. I suppose it's because you kind of get rid of that barrier of you being an outside person, if you get what I mean. Obviously people from Kansai speak to each other in a different ways, how people from Kansai and Tokyo speak to each other. It's the same way in which, for me, when I speak to another Australian, there's almost like, you just kind of it feels more natural to talk to an Australian. You kind of be yourself more easy than say if I'm talking to an American, if you get what I mean. Like, I feel like everyone feels that to some extent in, say I go abroad, for instance. Say I'm in Japan. If I meet another American or like someone else speaking English, it's like, oh yeah, cool. If I meet someone from Australia, it's different, you know what I mean? It's kind of different, isn't it? So it's the same thing if you know, say, a regional dialect, then you go to that region and speak it to them, your reception is going to be just like, crazy compared to if you just know Tokyo Japanese and in Tokyo or wherever else you go. Another reason that you might be inclined to learn a dialect in Japanese, and this is one thing I feel like I have as a benefit in my Japanese, is that, say, since I'm speaking with the Kansai pitch accent, in general, most of my words and that come from the Kansai pitch accent, and I speak in the Kansai, Kansai dialect. If I make a mistake in pitch accent or something like that, or pronunciation, well, mainly pitch accent, if I mess up my pitch accent a little bit, people just assume it's a part of my dialect. So it's almost like a cheat code of sounding better, because people just assume that if you mess up a pitch, oh no, that's just a regional dialect, you know what I mean? It's like, it helps so much in the way in which, like, I'll talk to people from Tokyo, and it's almost like my Japanese is going to sound way more perfect than it would if it was standard Japanese, because if I mess something up, they'll just assume it's a part of the regional dialect that I'm speaking. It's almost like, though, if you know standard Japanese, everyone knows what that's meant to sound like. If you mess up standard Japanese, instantly everyone's going to know you messed up your pitch accent, because they'll be like, oh, that sticks out because that's not standard Japanese. And all of a sudden, it becomes way more obvious when you mess up and you actually sound worse, because it's so much more obvious when you're deviating from the standard Japanese dialect, because it's set in stone. This is Tokyo Japanese, if you get what I mean. Like, everyone knows what that's meant to sound like. Dramas, anime, all that kind of stuff, news presenters, it's all in that Tokyo standard Japanese. So people are going to know when you mess up. But if you're like me, speaking in the Kansai dialect, if I say something that's kind of off, I use a bit of different pitch accent, they'll be like, oh, they don't even think anything about it, because they just assume it's part of like a regional dialect. So it sticks out much less. And all of it, I believe that's one of the reasons that my speaking sounds so perfect to a lot of people, is because when I make a mistake, it doesn't stick out as much. If you watch that Saito video where they critique my Japanese, there's a lot of things where I may or may not have made a mistake, but they've got no idea, because it sounds like someone would probably say that from some place in Japan. You get what I mean? Like, when I made when I was connecting words, it should have been, for the Kansai dialect, it should have been like, say, one pitch is here, at the end of this word goes here, and then the start of the next word will be a lower pitch or something like that. And I had them, closer together, which would be generally considered more standard Japanese, but more Tokyo Japanese. But either way, they talk it back and they say, was that correct? Was that correct? Yeah, it sounds right. It's much more easy to sound better, because there's no strict way in which you have to sound, if you get what I mean. Like, when you listen to people from regional areas or different dialects, they all have different kind of flavors to their Japanese, if you get what I mean. Like, one of my favorite YouTubers is from Fukuoka, and so he speaks Hakata Ben, and it's like, you listen to him and he's got completely different accents, completely different way of speaking. It's like, he could mess up something in his speech. Say, for instance, he might say something with the wrong pitch accent. I'd have no idea. I don't know what it's meant to sound like. It's completely foreign. It's not completely foreign, but it's different to me to the, Tokyo Japanese. When I hear the Tokyo Japanese, if someone messes it up, it's so much easier for me to even tell. I don't even speak the bloody dialect, and I can still tell. That's because it is it's less of standard Japanese, and it's more like common Japanese. It's used amongst all different areas. So as in it's known amongst all different areas, so people know when you mess up. So that's another reason you might consider learning a dialect. Now you might ask, okay, well, that's great. I want to learn a dialect, whatever, but how do I go about doing it? And the way I would do that is, you want to get probably the majority of your immersion from people in that dialect, or at least enough to be able to understand what it should sound like. So for instance, since I, not only do I want to learn the Kansai dialect, I love the way it sounded, way more than standard Japanese. Me personally, I don't really like how standard Japanese sounds too much. It's kind of plain for me. I prefer some sort of dialect. It gives more feeling to it, I feel like. But, that's just my personal kind of preference. But because of that, I end up listening to people mainly from Kansai. I get asked now, recommendations, people from Tokyo. I don't know any. To be honest, I don't know many. I mainly just listen to people from Kansai. As well, it's not a city, it's a region, so it's much easier. But I listen to many people from Kansai, and through listening to that, I kind of got the general sense of what it should sound like, and it made it relatively easy for me to mimic it. You know, the difficult thing with this is, say you want to learn a real regional dialect, like some places like a tiny little region like Nagano or something like that, where, like I said before, in general, if they're, you know, speaking any sort of media, like say YouTube or anything, where they'll use Tokyo Japanese to make it easier for everyone to understand, it's going to be hard to find enough material to immerse enough in it to get a good understanding of what it should sound like and thus reproduce it yourself. So I feel like if you're going to be like learning it in those smaller kind of regional dialects, unless you're living there or you personally know someone from there that you're talking to be able to get that sort of immersion, I don't know. I've never tried it and I've never seen anyone really have a good go at it. So I don't know how it would end up personally. You can have a go and see how it is. But yeah, just I don't know how you would approach that as much. I feel like you'd need to meet people from there, make friends from there to be able to kind of get a decent understanding of what that should sound like and reproduce it yourself. But yeah, for Kansai or, you know, any other dialect like that, say, you know, Hakata Ben, like I talked about before, you know, people from Fukuoka or something like Okayama Ben. For whatever reason, I've met a lot of people who speak that or seen a lot of people on YouTube that speak it. Same with the Kansai and, you know, the Fukuoka dialect. So they probably have enough materials for you to be able to kind of like watch enough of the YouTube or listen to podcasts and things like that and just listen to it enough to get a decent understanding of what it should sound like and thus reproduce it in your output. You know, it's fairly standard the way you approach this. It's the same way you'd learn pronunciation in any sort of Japanese or any language. You just focus your immersion kind of on that area and try and listen to it as much as possible to get a good understanding of what it should sound like and then reproduce it in your output. Obviously, talking to people from that area is also going to help us a lot as well. If, say, for instance, one thing I've had trouble with in the past is, say I'm learning the Kansai dialect, but all my friends are from Tokyo. When I speak to them, I'll still have a bit of the Kansai dialect, but it's so much more difficult to speak in a full, strong Kansai dialect when everyone you're talking to is not speaking it. It's a bit weird almost. Like, it's kind of like how if you see an Australian go to America for 10 years, he ends up with a bit of American accent. It just kind of happens, you know? It's just how humans reproduce language and that. So it helps a lot if you meet other people and make friends with people who are speaking the same dialect that you want to learn, because you'll be speaking it together and you'll get a better understanding of how you should speak it because you'll hear them speak it, you can mimic that, and as well you can get feedback on how you sound in terms of their reactions, and just, you know, it helps a lot to be speaking to people who speak the dialect that you want to be able to speak. Especially if we're talking about those smaller dialects like Hakata Ben or like some, you know, Nagano Ben or like some random dialect. If it's one of those things, it's going to help a lot if you're speaking to other people who speak the dialect, I feel like, to kind of create a bubble that you're living in almost, where you're using that dialect and immersing in it. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, and probably the biggest thing that I want to address throughout this entire video and an entire topic, is that there's so many people who are so neurotic about only immersing in one dialect or only coming into contact with one dialect and eliminating any other source of immersion that contains another dialect. Like, just stop that, you know? It's such a dumb way to do it. Like, the reason for that is like, it doesn't need to be 100%, you don't need to be 100% in contact with just one dialect. In a lot of ways, it doesn't even make any sense. You're going to end up only being able to understand one dialect when there's, you know, hundreds of dialects throughout Japan. So you're only going to say, for instance, if you're that determined to learn Tokyo Japanese, you learn Tokyo Japanese, you can speak Tokyo Japanese, all that, that's great. What happens when you go listen to someone from, you know, meet someone from Kansai or some other area, and because you've never interacted or heard that dialect, you're going to hear it and be like, what the hell is this person talking about? I've got no idea. And then what? You've just learned one fraction of the language. It's kind of like, imagine, right? You know, someone could only understand people from, I don't know, Texas. Like, they can only understand people from Texas, and anywhere else in the US, they've got no idea what they're talking about. Do you realize how impractical that would be, and just how weird that is to only understand one little dialect? Or if someone like only understands British English and they can't understand Americans or Australians, like, can you even really say you know the language? You have to be, you know, still immersing in other dialects and that, and it's so difficult to not be when the majority of people in Japan speak some sort of a dialect or are born in some area other than Tokyo. It's just like, for instance, one of the biggest sources of immersion I got was from people from Hakata, like, you know, Fukuoka, speaking Hakata Ben, so they speak a completely different dialect to the one I want to learn. But I was good enough, and you get good enough, to be able to discern the differences between the way you want to speak and the way someone else speaks in a different dialect to the dialect you want to learn, that you can listen to it and be like, you know, just keep it separate and say, I'm speaking like this is someone else. It's like, I listen to hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of hours of people speaking Hakata Ben, and I don't think you'll even find a hint of Hakata Ben in the way I speak. It's like, it's just like, for instance, you know, people always say, I've always said that, anime is a terrible source of immersion and all of that. When I say that, I don't mean like, oh, you can't watch any anime, you can't watch, any TV shows. That's not at all what I'm saying. All I'm saying is it should be at least a sizable portion of your immersion has to come from natural sources, so at least you can tell the difference. The problem arises when you only watch anime or you only read, because then all of a sudden you've got a warped sense of what natural Japanese sounds like, because you can't tell the difference between anime Japanese and natural Japanese, because your base is built in anime Japanese, so you've now got, when you're reading it, you can't discern the difference between the two types. It's the same thing here, Yeah, you say you want to learn Tokyo Japanese, a lot of your immersion, regardless of what you do, is going to be Tokyo Japanese, right? You're going to hear a lot of it and you're going to know what it should sound like. You're also going to hear a lot of people from Kansai. If you're watching TV or doing anything like that, or talking to people from Japan, you're going to meet people from different areas and hear their dialect. Just because you hear it doesn't mean you're going to speak it. One of my good friends is from Okayama. I've never listened to her and started speaking in Okayama Ben randomly. It doesn't really happen. Maybe you say one thing here and there when you're talking to them, but it doesn't, spill over into your speech all the time. Unless you're living in the area or something like that and completely surrounded by it constantly. That's different though, What I'm saying here is, as long as it doesn't even need to be the large majority, just have 50%, 40% even maybe of your immersion being in that dialect, and that is going to be enough for you to understand how that should sound, reproduce it in your output. But don't worry so much that you're not touching any other dialects. It's just again, with this, kind of analogy, it's imagine someone wants to learn how to speak they're from New York. That's what I would do. If I was learning how to speak English, I'd want to speak like someone from Brooklyn or something, because it sounds fucking cool. You know what I mean? I'd want to sound like that. But if they want to sound like that, yeah, they should hear and listen to people from that area. But they can't just listen to people from there, because then they're going to have no idea what anyone else is talking about. You can't be doing that. It'd be ridiculous to say, oh yeah, I want to learn how to speak like people from New York. So now when I learn English, I'm only going to watch YouTubers and only consume content of people from New York. Can you imagine how difficult that is and how just weird that is? It's just I don't get it, you know what I mean? It just seems kind of dumb to me. So if you want to learn Tokyo Japanese, good on ya, but you don't need to be consuming 100% Tokyo Japanese. Same thing if you want to learn the Kansai dialect. You don't have to be consuming 100% Kansai dialect all the time to the point where you don't take in any other source of media. Don't get overly neurotic with this whole process. Enjoy what you're listening to. Have fun with it. Listen to what you want. Don't get so obsessed with trying to master something that you lose the enjoyment of it. So, don't be so neurotic about trying to focus in on one dialect in your immersion. That's all I'm trying to say here. I hope I've made that clear enough with this little rant I've been on. But anyway, yeah, that's it for that kind of topic. But I just wanted to make that clear, that don't be too neurotic about trying to only listen to one dialect. Anyway, that's it for this video. I just wanted to kind of give a brief overview of the dialects in Japanese, how you can go about learning them and the kind of differences and all things like that. I hope you learned a bit in this video about the dialects, especially for those of you just getting into learning Japanese, because I'm sure you wouldn't have come into contact with too much sources explaining the differences and, the scope of dialects in Japanese. For me, I never knew dialects existed until however long into learning Japanese. It took a little while to even knew they existed. But yeah, that's if you want to have any more kind of resources for learning the Kansai dialect or any other dialect, in my Discord, I've got a huge amount of resources, a huge amount of people learning different dialects. So jump in there, you'll be able to talk to people who are also learning dialects, even learning standard Japanese, and just be in a kind of community where there's not such a focus on just one type of Japanese. But yeah, that's it for this video, guys. Thanks.